it's going. So yeah, so this session this evening is hosted by the Manchester Game Studies Network in collaboration with Gaming Lab and Asmodee Research. The two events that we are hosting are part of a global cycle of events investigating role-playing games and cultures, with happenings in France, the UK, Italy, Canada, and the US. Asmodee Research and Gaming Lab aim to encourage knowledge sharing by organising symposiums within the scientific community to promote tabletop game research and scheduling speakers to host talks during game events for the general public. We'd also like to thank the Manchester Metropolitan University Creative Writing, English Literature and Linguistics Centre for providing funding for the podcast, which hopefully some of you have been able to have a listen to in advance. So thank you very much to Cell as well. And if any of you are on Twitter, please feel free to comment, tweet about the event. We came up today with the hashtag #NileDice. We'd also like to thank Nikki Branch of the MGSN as well, who will be live tweeting part of this event today. As I mentioned, we have a podcast. This is available on the MGSN website, excuse me, which has been linked to in the chat. This was mixed and produced by Chris Gregory of Alternative Stories and Fake Realities podcast, who did a really wonderful job for both of our events. So thank you very much to him for his time and making this all work as well. For those of you who haven't had chance or didn't know about the podcast, don't worry, it's not essential. I'd also say for those who have watched it or listened to it, it's maybe the most Dungeons and Dragon-esque in terms of action and stuff that happens of all of the sessions that we've done, and maybe in some respects the least historical overall, but it certainly gives a flavour of what we're doing and what comes up. As I mentioned, the previous event, Dark Forest and Doomed Adventures, this was hosted by my colleague Chloe Germain, who is joining us again this evening, which looked at the ways in which players create, encounter and interact with the environment in indie role-playing games, and it involved developers and writers with various indie games, Cthulhu Hack, Shivering Circle, which was also the game that formed the podcast for that event, which you can also listen to online, and Trophy. So those of you especially, well, generally interested in tabletop role-playing games and indie games, please do check out the session, which is already up on our website. And so, I mean, apologies for all the scrolling. I'm using a different setup to what I normally do, so I'm making a mess of flicking back and forth slides. Like, this is my first time on Zoom. So without any, well, with all of the preamble done, just leaves me now to introduce our panelists and the schedule for today. So I think speaker's prerogative. I'll just introduce myself briefly first. I'm Jenny. I'm Senior Lecturer in Ancient History here at Manchester Met. I work primarily on social and economic history of Byzantine and early Islamic Egypt, with particular interest in village and monastic life. Our other panelists tonight include Alon, who is PhD candidate at Leiden University, and he examines Egypt and Iraq before and after the Islamic conquests. Ed Hayes, our DM, who has just joined Radboud University as a postdoctoral researcher. He's specialist in early Islamic history, working on the relationship between fiscal policy and religious protest in early Islam. Then Shergosh, who is a Marie Curie Fellow at Leiden University, who researches the history of the Nile Valley in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, and his current project centers on identity and memory in Christian Nubia. And then last but not least of our panelists, we have Aline, who is on the cusp of finishing her PhD, very exciting, at Leiden University, and within the PhD she uses Greek and Coptic papyri to explore the relationship between elites and local communities in early Islamic Egypt.
Hello.
So we are the panelists for this session. As you can see, we're all historians of the early Islamic world, from Nubia to Iraq. And we'll be talking this evening about our project that uses tabletop role-playing games, specifically for us, D&D 5th edition, to explore this period of history, namely the 7th to 9th centuries of the Common Era. We also have, I've mentioned them briefly, Chloe Germain, who will be acting as respondent after panel discussion. Chloe is senior lecturer here at ManMet and MGSN, sorry, in English and MGSN researcher. She's the author of various works on Gothic and horror, as well as deep roots for Cthulhu Hack that perhaps people in listening know of. And helping with the tech issues and generally being chat room manager is Paul Wake, reader in English, again here at ManMet, and co-director of the Manchester Game Studies Network. So thank you very much to Chloe and Paul for your support with this event as well. And then the very last thing, before I can get rid of the PowerPoint and stop making a mess of scrolling through it, just to give a mini indication of how our session this evening will play out. We have various topics that we would like to address between the players, our panelists this evening, going from building this world, as well as dealing with the game mechanics of D&D, to issues of identity and gaming and playing diverse characters, as well as what we hope to get from this project, for example, how the game influences us as historians, rather than just us shaping the game as we go through. The timings are entirely indicative, who knows? It seemed like a good idea to create some kind of schedule. We'll see how that goes, but we'd aim to finish our chats by 6 before we go to Chloe's response. And as I said at the very beginning, we're very keen to hear back from the audience, for all of you who have joined us, whether to ask questions about what we're doing, to provide suggestions about either other mechanics or other things that we could do, or projects that you know of that could be really interesting for us to examine. And so, with all of that long preamble in place, I will stop sharing that and instead get right into the panel. So as I said, it's going to be a kind of roundtable-esque discussion between those of us doing it. And we thought that the best place to start, before jumping straight in, would be why, or where did the idea for doing this even come from? And so for that, I will turn to Ed and Aline, who I think are going to talk about where the idea came from. Thanks, guys.
Yes, thanks, Jenny. So Ed and I have been playing in the same role-playing group where we have been trying out different role-playing games. And at some point we were playing Call of Cthulhu, and Ed was the game master. And at that point, for that, the context is the 1920s in Boston. And at some point, or different points in the game, different players were thinking about the historical accuracy of the objects that they were using, the things that they were doing. And I remember one case where someone he was a photographer, and he wanted to take a camera with him on the side to make pictures of some gruesome things that we found. And Ed said, well, I don't know if that was possible yet at that time. So we went into this deep Google search looking for photography technology of the time, and then we found out that there was such a camera and so on. And so afterwards, Ed and I had this conversation where we said, yeah, that was actually really fun, you know. And maybe it would also be a nice idea to explore the world that we study through this kind of role-playing. And so that's where we just started thinking about doing this. And I know we got really enthusiastic already from the first conversation that we had about it. But I think that Ed still has something to add to that.
Yeah, I guess as well, I would add that transition from the sort of sword and sorcery style Dungeons and Dragons. We hadn't only been doing Dungeons and Dragons, but basically that kind of high fantasy fantasy world, and then transitioning to this world where we had a very rich sense of the material culture, because it was not so long ago, you know, but far enough ago so that, you know, there's a bit of slippage, you know, you didn't know exactly what was possible, so you could make it up a bit as you go along. The transition into that world from the more sort of blank slate, I guess, world of a fantasy universe where, you know, there's everything is sort of made up, everything springs from somebody's head. It felt a lot more rich, and it was much closer to what we were doing as historians, I guess. We had also the project we were working on in Leiden was also a project to look at the early Islamic Empire as a whole. So we were all piecing together different parts of, you know, Aline as a Coptologist and Greek, somebody working with Greek and Coptic, and Alon and I as Arabists. And we have Reza, who's not here today, but who was working in the eastern end of the world with Sogdian and Pahlavi and Bactrian. All of those little pieces that we were adding to build up a world we thought maybe we could make a board game, or we could make a, you know, we were thinking of different ways that we could play with this. The board game never really went anywhere, I think partly because of the burden of creating mechanics. You know, we were more interested in exploring character, and so when the idea of role-playing it came out, it seemed sort of perfect, and we really got excited about it. And I think that excitement has continued throughout for all of us.
Yeah, I'd say when Aline and Ed messaged like, hey, we're thinking of doing this, exploring the 8th century world more or less through role-playing games, are you in? I was like, yeah, how can I say no to that? To just kind of like how it gets the imagination going and think about things, which is part of what we'll discuss today. And as Ed started with that mention of characters, and this is where we'd like to start the conversation tonight, and that's where, as part of putting together this world, is also in D&D putting together creating characters. And so we will start from here, and I've been volunteered to go first in this. So the players, now we will introduce our characters and why we chose the kind of characters, some reasons for various things. So for example, along those lines. And so for me to start, I had a few ideas, but in recent years, my research has really focused on the social and economic realities of monastic life in Egypt. So Christian monasticism, for me, primarily in the 7th and 8th century, so during the Islamic, after the Islamic conquest. And as part of this, I initially had been thinking about a character that also fit in with current discussions that had kind of transcended that world as well. So I know we have people from a diverse background, but the past decade, in terms of the discipline, one of the big things that stood out is a document that was published almost 10 years ago now, a fragment called The Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And this, I thought, would be something really fun to play with. Like, what if this was actually legitimate, or like these apocryphal texts, these early Christian texts? And I was thinking about a female monastic character that maybe didn't conform with Coptic orthodoxy, but was in some way connected with these texts. And I thought that'd be really interesting to also kind of look further into that. And so I built a female monastic character that was really into religious history. And so if those of you familiar with D&D, kind of go really stat heavy in intelligence and wisdom, but also into religion. And as I progressed in this, the more I reflected was that actually that's not where my research interests lie. And while I'm aware of this and it could be really interesting, it wouldn't feel authentic to me, because it's not the point that I want to pursue. And I think part of this whole project is really taking topics that we're interested in individually and seeing where they go. And so I started with this build and then backtracked and thought instead about the role of medicine and monasteries as places of healing, which quite a lot has been written about, but primarily from male monastic communities. And so for me, it was, okay, but what if a female community, how did the role of healers, doctors function in that? What's the relationship with the community? These histories, which we have a lot written about female monks in different places and different document types, but what don't we have written? What can we explore? How can we jump on from that? And so I modified the character's history and back, so she's actually not super interested in theological matters, so increasingly more reflection of myself as a researcher as well, but much more interested in the world around her and healing and how that fits in really nicely in D&D terms with the cleric build. And also on reflection more recently, after something Ed said as DM about monks being really hardy, one of the benefits, and we'll talk about kind of how we're using the D&D rule set later, is that I retroactively changed the character slightly as well and swapped her intelligence stats with her constitution stats. So thinking also kind of reflecting on what kind of person or characteristics does it take to be a monk, to have that kind of life. And so the character that I have now is one which aligns much more with my interests, which allows me to pursue like subaltern histories, bits that aren't written, which aren't recorded, but framed within a lot of stuff that we do know from normative and documentary texts to do with monasteries. So that's my character. She is a female monk called Theodora, daughter of Abraham. And within the world of D&D, she is a cleric of the life domain. So I don't know who wants to go next.
I just maybe a comment there is that I did give you a bit of bait in one of our adventures to see if you would take. I put in a Christological controversy there, a theological controversy in the monastery, and you totally didn't take the bait. You totally didn't get involved. So
the old character would have done. This one was a little bit perturbed about the nature of the monastery in terms of its setting, but yeah, I've been trying to think authentically about then that character. But yeah, lots of baits from the DM. Aline, as you're the person I see, would you like to go next?
Sure. My character is called Feybasia, and she's a woman. So going into this adventure, I think I immediately said, ooh, I want to play, in any case, I want to play a female character, because I thought immediately that would be challenging, since we're going to build a party of adventurers, because that's what you do in Dungeons and Dragons. You have adventures. And so I thought, well, I have to find a way to include a woman traveling with these other people who will start out, in any case, as strangers. So that's one part, well, an important part of the build. Then of my character. Then some other things are more related to the things that I'm interested in terms of research also now. So Feybasia in D&D terms, as a class, she is a bard, which means generally that she is very good at talking, and she has a high charisma, if we're talking about D&D stats, which she uses to persuade people, to talk her way out of difficult situations, etc., but also to play music, to sing, and generally to use her voice and her words to make things happen in the world. And that fits more or less in some aspects of my dissertation, and in general in what interests me most about studying this period, is that how people used language, how they used social relationships to get what they want. If they have a problem, how are they going to solve that? They might use certain language, they need to talk to the right person, etc. And so I've been using documents for this, so written text, and Jenny also alluded to this already. What we have as historians, or the types of historians that we are, is written text. And so we know what is written in the letters. We know how people talk to each other in letters, but we also know that there's a large part of these relationships, of these interactions, that were done orally. And so for me, one of the important things that I wanted to explore, that I still want to explore, is how these oral interactions developed. If I can explore that in playing the game, and then especially then as a woman in this world. So in terms also of Dnd things, that's also why I chose as the college of, or the specific domain of my BARD is the College of Eloquence, which is not a standard Dnd BARD college. It's from an I've been muted by someone. Is that a, was that was that a warning?
No, that's a hiccup. Please
Okay.
go on with your elegance.
Feybasia is really not used to people muting her, so, but okay. Another thing I wanted to add is also when I made this character, trying to think of how she would travel. First, we had thought of having her have a bunch of servants that would allow her to travel, so she would not be by herself, and they might then die in some kind of tragic accident. She would be left by herself and then needed a party or something like that. But in the end, we came up with me, or Feybasia, having this cousin, Apollonia, who acts as a type of servant and a confidant for her, so they travel together. And then that also led, I think, into some interesting development of game mechanics for NPC servants. I think we will talk about that later. NPCs, sorry, non-player characters, for those not used to Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games. And then the last thing that I would like to add is Feybasia is a magic user. So as a bard, she has a type of magic that we can explain away a little bit, or that I explain away by saying, okay, she makes things happen in the world, she charms people, she makes people fall asleep by using these musical talents and these vocal talents and her rhetoric, etc. So that's one part of her magic. But I also want to explore a different type of magic for her that is more built on curses and spells, of which we find evidence from the late antique and medieval world. But I think that's also something that we will talk about more, how magic and the magic of Dungeons and Dragons, which is so important in the game, fits in what we do. So I think that's all I have to say about Feybasia at this point. So again, she is a bard of the College of Eloquence. She is fairly rich, so she is in the kind of highest social bracket in one of the urban centers along the Nile. So in the countryside, but in an urban center. So she's not, but she is quite rich. Yeah.
Thank you, Alina. Like so many points I think touched on there that we're exploring, kind of where the world that we're building meets D&D, and kind of a couple of questions have come up as well about like kind of type of role-playing game that D&D is and how that may influence some things. But some of the things, well, I'd say that, you know, we're modding things slightly. We'll talk about that more lately. But Aline mentions a few things that I think we'll pick up on later. NPCs, the role of magic. You also mentioned money. Important thing. We're never going to be D&D rich in terms of how we play this game. Like one good question, just briefly, do we have visuals to share? We don't, and this is something that we could address later, but basically we're quite visual light also when we play. We have the odd plan, the odd thing, but that's a good point to consider later, kind of what we do after this as well. So yeah, I think we'll pick up on some of the things that Elaine mentioned later, but Alon, you are the next person in my screen if you'd like to introduce your character.
Yes, so first of all, thank you for having us. So I'll start by saying that I'm very new to this. This is my first ever gaming experience. And the reason I accepted it at first was because it sounded interesting, and because when Ed and Elaine suggested, I just had a fear of missing out, and I couldn't bear the thought that they're going to have fun without me. So that was my first motive. And why did I choose? I chose to play Abdallah. He is an Arab Muslim ex-military guy that settled in Egypt. His family is originally from Al-Ramla, which is in nowadays, from Dnd Spells, which is nowadays Israel. And he is a battle master now. And the reason I said that I'm very inexperienced is well, I'll get to that in a second. But first, as Jenny mentioned, I tried to research both Egypt and Iraq. And recently, I've been focusing more on the Umayyad period. And recently, I started to explore the relations between the caliphs, i.e. the empire rulers, provincial elites, provincial Arab Muslim elites, and the governors that were sent from the center or got to power from the province within. And I am very, very much interested in the provincial Arab Muslim elites and how do they actually act as elites. What are their social networks? What are their sources of income, of status? And this is why I actually chose this Abdallah. I would also add that I can't tell you all the reasons that I chose him for, because my colleagues don't know of my future plans for the game. For that, I'm sorry. I would just add though that recently I also got very interested in rebellions, how rebellions broke out, what does rebellions require, what kind of social interactions does rebellions create, and how the government or the rulers react to rebellions. And that's something that I think I might actually want to explore maybe later. So Abdallah, as I said, is an ex-military guy. He's a battle master. He's a very strong person. And at first I was inexperienced, and I think I was too eager to fight every time. And that's something that I learned. I think also, and I've seen it in the chat, couple questions about that. I came to realize that D&D does create these situations for you. I encourage you to fight in a way. And more recently, I've been trying to mold Abdallah to be a bit more calculated guy, to explore how actually he can interact with other people rather than just fight everywhere. And I think we are all more interested in creating this type of game. I think we might also discuss this a bit later. Yeah, and another thing is that I'm very much also interested in these relations of people coming from Syria, settle, immigrate to another place. I chose for Abdallah to have a Coptic wife. What kind of new networks does this type of marriage create? How does this help you? Or what kind of disadvantages does it give you? And this is things that I would very much, well, I can't wait to actually continue in the game and explore a bit more as we go along. Yeah, and that was my introduction.
Thank you, Alon, and thank you also for addressing some of the questions. A couple of people have pulled up, the kind of how the particular gaming choice shapes some of the decisions and some of the activity, and kind of how we're also working within that kind of framework as well as within the historical framework that we're interested in. And so that brings us to Shergosh as our last player / character. So Shergosh, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. So there are two sides of the story of my character. One is scholarly and the other is personal. So I got into this quite by accident. We were having beer one evening with Alon and Ed, and it turned out that we all love RPGs, and they mentioned that they would have a plan to create a historical setting in the D&D world, and I said, well, yeah, of course. I love I haven't been playing D&D for ages now, but I will definitely love to jump in. And then I realized that it would perfectly go along the line of my current research project. So the exploring of identity of Christian Nubia. So as Jenny has already said, I am researching this strange piece of land of which very few people know. Very few people know of existence of medieval Nubia. So there is this land, even among historians. There is this land beyond the first Nile cataract that there was, and nobody really knows what was there. So it happens that during the Middle Ages there were Christian kingdoms there, and they were quite powerful in the region, and their history is still kind of a mystery to us. There are not many sources about Nubian history and the Nubians. So one of the tasks in my current project is to know who these people really were, how they pictured themselves, and how the others pictured them. And it was quite obvious from the outset for me that I will play a Nubian. So the next step was to establish what type of Nubian or what class of Nubian person I would be representing, because we have so few information about Nubian people, or the people inhabiting the Middle Nile Valley in the Middle Ages. It couldn't be quite obviously a commoner, because we practically know nothing about how the common people, what the common people did, what were the occupations, how they behaved, what was their mindset, what was their viewpoint, world viewpoint, and so on. So it had to be an aristocrat or a higher echelon of society, representative of higher echelon of society, because of them we know relatively, we are relatively well informed. And so I chose to be a kind of Nubian prince. My character is a nephew of a king, who is normally, in normal circumstances, would be entitled to the throne, because medieval Nubia had a matrilineal system of inheritance when the son of sister's king, king's sister, sorry, the son of king's sister inherited the throne after the death of the current ruler. I won't be betraying anything from my backstory, because this is already known by my fellow players, that the king decided to change the tradition and remove me from the list of the heirs, and instead put in my place his own son. So my character accepts his fate and decides to become a bishop. So he sets off on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So this is the type of person that I decided to play. The other part was to choose a class for my character, And this is when the personal aspect of character building comes in, because one of my friends once told me that I would be a perfect paladin, not only in RPG but also in life, because I sometimes, well, like quite often, I am very strict as far as rules, any rules are concerned. So because I have never played a paladin before, I decided that this would be a good moment to do that. So Marian Kuda is both an aristocrat, a prince, and a paladin, a defender of the faith and the kingdom and his family. Yeah, so he is traveling with his faithful servant Dharma, and well, it's in southern Egypt. He comes across this his new companions, which with whom the fate has connected him, and yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you, Shergosh. I think from those 4 characters, and some of these points I think better maybe addressed either in Q&A or with Chloe's response, but in terms of the diversity of the characters we're playing, also being diverse from ourselves, and something we're very conscious of, and I think we can discuss later. Everyone's picked up different parts about what it means to take on this kind of endeavor in terms of not just character building. A few of us have mentioned the kind of world building, whether it's journeys, where people come from, building a party, what brings these 4 characters together, as well as game mechanics. So we have this balance throughout between an RPG and the fact that you have to play a game, right? You have to have characters come together, and how do you make that happen? So we thought that would be a good turn to switch initially to this area of world building and bringing everything together. And for that, I would like to invite Ed to jump in and talk about this, especially as it's his job as the games master to really think about a lot of these settings. Over to you, Ed.
Jenny, yeah, and it's very interesting to hear all of you reintroduce your characters, of course, who I'm familiar with, but it's interesting to, I love the way Alon says, I chose Abdullah. You could have said I created Abdullah, but it's as if he's there. He's sort of concrete in your mind already. Or did he choose you, Alon? But anyway, so yes, well, I maybe just mention as well, in terms of the way my research gives me a background to this. Well, compared to all of the rest of the characters, my research isn't really directly connected. I don't work on Egypt. And so in a way, I'm the least well-equipped to be the DM for this. It's been fun doing bits of research, and I do it sort of in this episodic way. So I say, oh, how do they travel up the Nile? Like, what kind of boat would they use? How much did it cost? And I'm constantly sort of feel I've got to keep just one step ahead of what's happening in doing research. But obviously I've got a broader interest in this moment in time and this world. I'm very interested in, and I think that those of us who work on the same project also share an interest in the complexity of this world, both sort of in between, what was part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and then the new style of life that gradually changes with the Arab Muslim conquest, but a lot of things are there. And then in Egypt, of course, you've got echoes of the sort of this very long Egyptian history, right? With Eileen mentioned the Coptic magic that she's told me has some of this this long history embedded in it. The longer history of Egyptian religion is there. It's a very connected world as well. So it's on the Mediterranean. It's also there with the Indian Ocean, Arabia, Europe, and the rest of Europe is there, and the sort of conflictual aspect with the Muslim and Christian interactions, particularly the great empires, Byzantium and the Arab Muslim Empire, but also to India, you know, Central Asia. These are all parts of the world that we're thinking about. Both, so it's a very rich world historically. It's also a rich world in terms of the imagination, because we have all of these literatures, you know, the Greek, the Coptic, the Arabic, the Hebrew, the Persian world. You know, all of this is material that we can draw on, and I can draw on to explore and to generate ideas for how the adventures can be put together. That being said, the way that because I don't feel an expert, I don't feel like when I'm creating games. So for example, I play D&D with my children quite a lot, and there I feel totally the master of the universe. I can do whatever I like. It's a blank slate as well. And so you start with a blank map, and then you say, you meet in a tavern in this town, and there's a castle there, and there's a river there. No, I can't do that, right? There is a map. In a way, we're exploring the maps, because, you know, we started north of the first cataract of the Nile, so just in that area close to where Shergosh's character Marian Kuda comes from, and in between there and where the other characters come from. But so we are exploring a map in a sense, but it's a map that's already populated, regardless of what I do. Obviously, I can make things up, and I do, but it's a very rich world that we're entering in, and the way I manage that is to really to use the characters. So the characters of all of the players have got a very rich sense of who their characters are, an extremely fine granular sense of where they fit into their own worlds, especially. None of us are experts about everything, though, so we all bring together our pieces, and so the world building really is a collaborative sense. I try and talk to the players and say, you know, what is your character doing with this? What is your character doing with that? We try and look ahead a bit, but also obviously I present them with surprises. I present them with challenges. I don't know how they're going to respond to them. And it's very interesting to see. And then we have these sort of, sometimes we have little footnote sessions at the end where he said, ooh, would my character have done that? Or we do, occasionally we pause right there and said, oh, how do I address your character? You know, so that there was an occasion, I think in the recording that we did, where Eileen's character says, well, how would a Greek noble or a rich Greek woman address this Nubian, you know, outsider, but same religion, but different language, you know, how would I address you? That's convey that sense of social asymmetry. So that's a very you know, that's a very exciting process for me. The other big thing, and we can talk more about all of this, but the other big thing I would say is that one of the main things I wanted to do was sort of help the characters get a sense of being a party, you know, and that's, again, maybe that's drawing from Dungeons and Dragons, where the basic unit of play is the party, and it's sort of assumed that, you know, the characters meet in a tavern and they're immediately bound together. And also, I guess, role playing in general, you know, you can have more conflictual relationships, but the basic understanding is that if one person goes to Jerusalem, then you're all going to Jerusalem. You're not going to be going off in exploring different parts of the map at the same time. And that was difficult. I mean, I think there's ideally a good DM for Dungeons and Dragons would try and create an organic sense of the unity of the party. But here, what do these characters have? An Arab Muslim soldier, a Nubian, a wannabe bishop, you know, a much lower status nun, and this aristocratic or noble, rich Greek Coptic woman. Why would they be traveling together? Well, we discussed this together, and the idea of pilgrimage made a lot of sense. And if you think of you know, texts about pilgrimage, there are moments when different, you know, you have an odd group of people together traveling in a caravan. And it did seem to make sense that there could be this slightly odd sense of sympathy across boundaries developing. that was one thing. So we decided that together. And then in the course of the adventure, I've been trying to create moments where, you know, the characters have to stay together in the same place, just physically stay together in the same place. I don't want Feybasia, Eileen's character, going off and staying with some rich relative and leaving the rest, you know, Jenny's poorer character. I want them to be there in the same place physically. And the other one is a sense of, you know, shared danger. That's where the violence comes in. So the question about the chat, I think an external threat is quite useful in about binding a party together. And then at the end of the bit, if you listen to the podcast, you'll hear a very clear intervention on my part, where, you know, they swear a pact together, and that's like, okay, now you're a party. So, but that took a while. That took several hours of play to generate a sense of, yes, you are a party together. I think I'll leave that there.
Can I add something to that last point?
Of course.
Well, I think Jenny, especially already in the first session, she did also make an effort to bring at least part of the party together. Because I remember in the first session, we were waiting, all of us were waiting for a boat to travel on. And she consciously said, well, my female character is going to go up to this other female character accompanied by her servant, and because of the women, you know, looking, well, getting closer together and finding a sense of security together at that point. So I thought that was a nice way of already bringing the characters together. And then I think at some point we weren't talking to each other, and I think even in the podcast at some point I wasn't even sure if I knew everybody's names of the characters, and then we had been playing for several sessions already. So that's a testament to what Ed was saying, that it's a lot slower and not evident, not super evident that we would be a party already. But now I don't know what I was going to say. Well, yes, that we had been observing each other. We had been hearing conversations. I had noticed that Jenny's character Theodora had some very impressive healing abilities that really interested Feybasia as a character as well. And so that was also one way for us as players to prepare for getting together, I think, by observing the other characters, what they were doing and what was special about them. I know I can't say everything again backstory wise, but Feybasia has noticed things about the different characters that make her very interested in them, and she thinks they might be able to help her in the future.
And the linguistic aspect is interesting in terms of the observation. You're saying what we're going, the fact that, you know, we have we don't have the common tongue. We have Arabic, Greek, Coptic, Nubian, and the fact that some of you when you're observing, you're not just observing what the content, but also the specific language and the register that's being used.
Yeah, and to follow up, I think a lot of things we want to discuss are all interweave, and people have been mentioning in the chat various points that were part of our initial discussions and ongoing discussions. And to pick up on what Ed and Aline said, you know, think about historic context and thinking about gender relations and identity and being conscious of who is likely to talk to whom is one thing. And one thing I think it'd be nice to address is, it's mentioned a few times about why choosing D&D, and a few people have initially hit it on the head that D&D is familiar, like most of us apart from Alon had experience of playing D&D, so in terms of a rule set it was easier to jump in than maybe, and also the support systems that there as well, kind of in terms of character building and everything else. It has a practicality to it. Is it perfect for what we want to do? No. But I'd also say that kind of trying to navigate the game mechanics throws up interesting things as well. So, you know, Ed and Lean, Bill mentioned, and Shergosh mentioned as well, kind of like being in as one and like just getting a boat, and we're thinking about money. Like, we're not using gold, silver, and copper coins, right? Or platinum, heaven forbid, you know, this kind of D&D money where here's 10 gold coins, go and do stuff. That's unrealistic. No one's, especially like a nun, right, is not going to walk around with cash on them. And a lot of the initial collaborative stuff that Ed was discussing was us looking at publications about how much things actually cost. Kind of like, can we, so in terms of economic history, you know, deep diving into that to try and make it this authentic world, you know, so it's modifying, it's not just going off a standard D&D price list, but D&D has functionality to help us all. And I think also just kind of how rules heavy it is in terms of thinking about characters. And a few people have mentioned magic, and Aline mentioned magic, and D&D does give us that space to work with magic. So I think one thing we're all conscious of is that the ancient world, you know, magic does have a place. Whether it's Aline's mentioned Coptic texts, we have many Coptic, Greek, and early Egyptian magical texts, curses, love spells, healing spells, amulets, you know, protective, like negative and positive. You have divine miracles. I was thinking when framing mine about my nun that one of the most important Coptic monks of the 5th century, Shenouda, after going to ecumenical councils in the northern Mediterranean, he flies back to Egypt on a cloud. You know, we have normative literature which has these kind of miracles. And I know very little about Arabic magic. But there is opportunity for that. Monks being troubled by demons, which was part of this first campaign that was on the podcast, and struggling against the devil. And so in terms of my character, she's not proactively thinking about magic, but she can call upon divine protection, divine support. So it then fits in, the D&D mechanisms allows that to happen as well. Other kinds of magic may be more difficult to integrate. And so it's not kind of like carte blanche as well. Just before I open up to the other panelists, in terms of also the kind of history and end goal, I think we'll come back to them at the end. Thank you for everyone for posting questions. Do keep them on. But do any of the other panelists want to jump in terms of some of the topics that have come up there in terms of magic?
Sorry, can I just jump in? So a question in the chat, somebody suggesting it's funded. This is not funded. This is something we basically did it for fun, did it for our own interest, and then Jenny, because she has colleagues in the in Manchester who work in this game network, suggested we could have a public event and reflect upon it. So that's just to clarify that.
Yeah, to say the only funding we had for this was the podcast, which came from a small part of internal funding.
Right, but
we'll get on to the.
But our playing together was something we started just for our own interest, right? And no, the event is not. No, the podcast. The person who created the podcast was compensated because he's a professional, but we are not compensated.
Yeah, this is not going to bring us any D&D money. But I mean, some of these questions we'll go back to. Does anyone want to? Sorry, I muted myself. Does anyone want to jump in and reflect on any of the points? Whether, or any other points in terms of world building, magic, fighting. Alon.
Well, no, just maybe to go back to what Eileen suggested and talked about, and what Ed was talking about of how to get the group together, I would just say that to me, one of the interesting points is how do people get together and talking or not, what brings people together and what separates them. And actually the first session that we had started, yes, with Jenny and Eileen kind of talking together, waiting for the boat, but there was a bit of a standoff between me and Shergosh's character. And that's where we started from. And then as we went along, I think I learned to appreciate some of his characters' merits, basically, mainly the way that he fights and the way that he doesn't shy away from troubles. And that was interesting to me to think of, okay, then, you know, what can bring these Arab Muslim and this Nubian guy together? And I think it's a nice way of breaking group identities that, as researcher, at least me, I think most of us do, we tend to put people in categories and to think, yeah, well, you know, it's a material thing that can bring people together or a certain specific situation. But yeah, but I think there are so many other interactions between human beings that we can explore. And I think it's a very nice way to add this to my research in the back of my head, that yes, I have to use these categories because that's my sources tells me, but to just keep in mind that there are so many other interactions that we can think of in every specific situation. I also see.
I think from that point of view, it's interesting that your character is married to a Christian woman, because certainly we have these normative texts that say, oh, you shouldn't, you know, it's best not to marry across boundaries, and, you know, the legal literature is full of, oh, what happens with inheritance and all the problems it creates. But clearly people were. Normative texts don't want to, you know, to explore the messiness. So it's nice for us to have, well, you know, a Nubian and an Arab go into a tavern, what, you know, get on a boat together, what do they say to each other? It's the area that is, you know, that is fruitful to explore imaginatively when we're not sort of bound by having to be responsible historians, staying within what our sources tell us.
Yeah, I think just to jump in now, also to reflect some of the questions, you know, some of them about what are our end goals, what do we want to get out of this? And for us, I think most of this was to explore kind of the data, to think about it in different ways. For example, for me, thinking about money, think about what do you carry with you when you travel. Kind of a lot of those mechanics, the system mechanics from D&D have made me think about, okay, what actually happens when people are put in this situation? We know people traveled. What do they do? Is it literally with the clothes on their back? What do they take? How do they go about it? Who do they talk to? Do they talk to people? How do they address people? What kind of people do they come across, and in what kind of situations? So a lot of the stuff which is on the edges of what the texts tell us, whether it's literary texts or documentary texts, letters, you know, we can populate this world. And so for us, there isn't an end goal. In the story terms, at the minute, it's to get to Jerusalem and see what that throws up. We're still a long way from Jerusalem. For us to address some other games, like using role-playing within this, and also D&D, is to use something that's created, that's established, that we can fit into a lot of the mechanics without creating stuff ourselves. But then we can mod that as we have to be able to facilitate the historic reality of what we're playing in. And some of the questions that have come in about, like, how do you build worlds? How do you make historical role-playing games? I think we can return to that in a bit, because some of the questions are quite long. I think take us a little bit of a moment to read through them. But what we've found, and whether your panelists like to jump in, is having this framework which makes us think about game mechanics, but how that reflects on the characters, and then jumping in and using all the material that we know, archaeology, texts, material culture, literature, feeding that in and saying, okay, this is what we can do along the way, but also let's have fun. And for me, the past year has been tough, right? Teaching from home, heavy workloads, and this has reinvigorated me for kind of thinking about research in a way that I didn't beforehand. So personally, kind of this using games to creatively explore research has opened up whole lines of potential research questions that I never thought of before. So for us, it's not about creating a game. It's about using mechanics that exist and bringing into those concrete things, at least that we think we know, interpretations of evidence that survives, and Egypt especially is abundant in this respect, and allowing us to the space to explore things in a non-standard way, rather than thinking, okay, we're going to create a game to teach history. I think that's really interesting, and there's opportunities for that. But before some of the other questions, would anybody else like to jump in?
Well, yes. So an example of, for me, what you were saying is that in terms of game mechanics, then defining a little bit how we play, is that the magic, which we talked about already before. But for example, as my character class, the things that she can do means that she's using magic. And so I was thinking, wow, this is difficult in this Christian world. And so that made me think of how that would happen in practice. So Jenny already mentioned all the evidence, all the kind of texts that we have, and real magical items, real magical spells from that time. So I'm really now fascinated to explore this this person who is going to have, because I'm playing the game, she is going to have to use magic, and how would she do that practically? So for now, for example, in the game, every time she has to say a spell, she's doing it, you know, under her breath. She has, in D&D, you have these spell components, like material components that you use for spells. And so in her luggage, or the things, the pouch that she brings with her, she has these little bottles with these components in them, and she pretends like they are beauty products, for example. So it's just, I mean, it's a game, right? But that's something that I'm really interested in developing more and just reading about much more. And as Jenny said, so many topics, when you play, so many topics come at you because you're in that world and you think, oh, that thing over there, how would I interact with that? I used a needle at some point. It's like, what kind of material would this needle have been made of? What kind of thing would I have brought with me where my sewing equipment was in? And then the things that I already mentioned about her traveling alone with a servant. What is my relationship exactly with this my cousin servant, and so on. So at any given time, because you're in that world, there are a plethora of things around you that you think about, how would this character interact with that? And it's yeah, what Jenny said, so invigorating, so many different things to explore. Yeah, I've been noting down bibliography books about pilgrimage, women traveling, and indeed also many things related to material culture. So yeah, so the magic thing is one example of how the game mechanics of D&D, which might seem limiting, actually for me opened up a whole new thing to think about in in the ancient world, and how people moved around in it and lived in it.
Yeah, like just about that, and a couple of questions came up that jumped straight into that. Gianluca's about D&D spells or create historical spells. We are using in part D&D spells, but there's also that flexibility to homebrew, as it were. And I think that'd be a really interesting thing to pursue. It's actually kind of where we are at the minute in gameplay. There is a magical text, a magical codex, so seemingly we don't know yet, has been introduced to the mix. And so magical texts have been published quite a lot. We have that material, and it'd be really interesting to pursue how that goes. And as part of that, someone mentioned about what game mechanics are hard, and the magic in D&D is hard. You know, we're never going to have a 500 gold worth diamond to use as part of a component for a spell. So we're not being that kind of D&D specific in that point.
I've encouraged you all to sort of think outside the classes, or, you know, use the classes, because that leveling up is fun, but also to think what your character would have. But I mean, we all want to have fun, basically. So there is always a balance between, you know, fun and keeping it a game, and using the historical aspect.
I think Oliver, the point that he raised, which is also in chat at the minute in my face, about favorite research questions that are created or something that's come out, and say that, you know, we're still relatively early in this, but as this has come out, for example, from my perspective, and I think it'd be quite nice to hear from other people. Last week, I was at a seminar presented about girls and girlhood in monasteries, and it reflected on how little information we actually have, like the texts that are written by men, these normative documents, how little women's communities are mentioned, and they tend to be in a period before the one that we're looking at. So for me, part of the research questions that I'd like to pursue coming out of this are, what is the position of female communities? What is the variety in female monastic communities? What is their relationship with the male communities in this period? What is it with each other? And so looking for that, and it's research which there's a little bit of work been done on it, but for me, I'm like, oh, that is super interesting, because I kind of feel more invested now as well, kind of how it's come to it. And so that isn't where I thought I would go at all with this project. So for me, using this exploration has thrown this up. And from originally I was going to play with theology, but also amulets, healing. Would a female monk in the early 8th century draw upon magical texts, many of which were produced in monastic contexts, to help heal somebody? And those kind of questions. Alon.
Yeah, so to me, there are two things. I think there's one that is indirect influence on my research, which is, again, you know, at the beginning of almost every introduction that I ever wrote, I wrote that the early Islamic Empire ruled a vast territory with so many different cultures and religions, and so on and so forth, and they were a vast minority. But then, to me now, to travel through Egypt as Arab Muslim and being the minority, it really helps me a bit understanding how great of an achievement that was, or how hard of a task that was. And the other thing is, it actually came out pretty recently, last week, I think, where Jenny asked me something about swords, and then I started to read about swords. And then yesterday, also a bit following with a discussion with Ed, I got into the question of, you know, who got to hold swords and where in the Islamic Empire, who had publicly wore swords, because, you know, we're thinking of sociological works of empire studies of who has the monopoly over power and over violence and stuff like that. And it's not something that I still, you know, framed into a research question or really looked at all the bibliography, but it's something that I think now of how to pursue in the future. I see that someone asked us to let them know when the first outcome comes, but I would not hold my breath to that. It takes time, but yeah, but that's an example, I think, of something that might turn into a research following this experience. But again, is really new to all. I mean, we didn't do a lot. We did quite a few hours, but we're not very progressed in the game, I think.
Thank you, Alon. Before we move on, would anybody else like to add to that point in terms of how the game is impacting research? Because I think that's one of the things we want to get out of it. It's not just how our research builds this world collaboratively, but also vice versa. Shergosh.
Yeah, it's I wanted to add that. So in my case, it's not about a research question that developed thanks to our game, but rather the research attitude that I have never had before we started playing. So already Ed has mentioned that we have this discussion how we should address one another in our game, people of different statuses, and then we started thinking, yeah, my lord, my liege, I don't know how it would be in Greek, how it would be in Coptic, how it would be in Arabic. And these are the types of things that you, when you study documents in Greek, Coptic, Arabic, you take for granted, and you just translate them and forget about them. And then having to apply what you know, what you have read, what you have studied in a game context makes you think differently about the sources that you read. These all titles of addresses, my lord, my glorious father, my glorious brother, my glorious lordship, or whatever, you don't longer treat it as a mere element of formulary, but as you try to think whether this could be a part of the living language. And I'm sure that when we progress, there will be tons of things like that we will be discussing and pondering about. So in this way, I think that my research and research of all of us can be influenced. And I think it's a positive thing to not overlook all these small details, which can also tell us a lot about the society. But this is our ultimate goal, to know how this society functioned and how all not only as a whole, but also as some of its different parts.
Yeah, I love that. I think Aline wants to jump in. I just wanted to reflect quickly. I think especially many of us playing are philologists. We work with texts. We get used to translating really mechanically. You know, this word translates as this word, and lose some reflection in terms of the social linguistics, like relations between people, how things function in reality. And when Elaine and those who've listened on the podcast, Elaine says, it's like, how would I address Shergosh? You know, we can see that he is a, well, I think at this point we'd already learned that he was a prince from previous interactions. He's mentioned he's going to Jerusalem. We can tell he's a wealthy individual. And Elaine voiced what I've been thinking about for a while. I'd be like, oh, in Coptic, he'd be Pajois, right? He'd be my lord. Surely I'd reflect this is him. And in our current one, we're dealing with the local Arab governor, the local emir, and I've been racking my brain. We spoke about this a little bit of like, oh, which title would I actually employ. And so bringing
is he an Arab emir or is he a convert? You haven't figured out yet. Is
all of these questions,
an Egyptianized Arab or an Arabized Egyptian?
Exactly, I think.
But all the same, he has a certain status, regardless of whether he's a convert or a Muslim by birth. You have to address him as an emir.
Indeed.
I think actually, sorry to preempt Alina again, Brian question, this is something that is really important and which we've been thinking about, I think, from the onset. Just to read out Brian's question in the comments. Also, cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation can be fine lines to walk. What are your thoughts on engaging with ancient cultures that can still be meaningful to us today? How do you approach ancient cultures with your own biases? This is such an important question. I think also it stands in really stark contrast with a lot of the issues with D&D and race presentation as well. And for me, I've been very conscious of playing a figure, a woman very different from myself, but also that she is part of a still living community. And from my respects, in terms of that approach, it's stopping and thinking and trying to be respectful about the texts, about, as a non-believer myself, what it means to be a religious person and to have that be very much an important central part of your life. A monk, right? It's the main part of her life. And loads of questions on identity that I think we're all interested in, and how to work with that by being respectful and not being flippant and not being disrespectful. It's kind of a ham-fisted way. It's a really good and very complicated, I think, question. Does anyone else want to jump in then or reflect on a previous point? Aline, sorry, I cut you up several times.
Okay, several things then. I'll try to be brief. One thing about what Shergosh said about the titles is of course, it's very relevant, but I want to mention that actually in Leiden, and the project that I'm working on and Alon is working on and Ed used to work on, we are actively researching terms of kinship, like my father, brother, son, in letters and in documents, to try and understand the relationships that these words shaped or confirmed, and what the role, the function was of these kind of terms. So we are actually trying to do that kind of research. So that's also part of why I had been thinking about how would I address Marian Kuda. So that's also a way in which our research informs our gameplay. The other thing I wanted to also add to what Shergosh was saying is that my character is partially inspired by these letters from late antiquity that we have, where women are requesting help from an authority figure, and they are saying, well, I'm so poor, I'm destitute, you have to help me because of this. But then they also mention that somebody deprived them of their inheritance, or they sold their house without them knowing, or they are working on their land. So these women weren't actually as poor as they're trying to make themselves out to be. So that's also something. So what Shergosh was saying, like, how is what we are reading in the documents, how would that play out in real life? So that's also something that with my character I'm trying to explore these kinds of interactions. Would you use the same rhetoric? How would that work? And then I would like to say something about the identity of my character as well. So Ed has been calling her Greek a couple of times, which is not, it's part of her identity in a sense that it's part of her culture, but she is an Egyptian. Yeah, so that's something that I don't want to emphasize too much. I mean, it's a fun, like a little running gag in the game where Jenny is how do you say that? She's making fun of my character for being too Greek or something like that. So this is just a part of the identity, of the cultural identity of this character. She is an Egyptian, just as Theodora is.
I think this is so important to stress. Sorry, Alon.
Yeah,
that Egypt is such a multicultural place at this time. Alon.
Yeah. So just to comment on the last point of cultural appropriation. So this is very not new to me, I have to say. I'm an Israeli, and it's something that I think from day one of your research, you ask yourself, how do you, as a contemporary Israeli that grew up in Israel, you know, with all the complexities of nowadays, how do you actually research Muslims, and what are the biases that comes with that? And it's something that I've, throughout the whole, well, saying career sounds make it too dignified, but throughout my training as a historian, is something that I try to be very conscious to. Also, you know, telling my students in Israel when I used to teach, I think the basic thing is to have empathy toward your research subjects, and to really try and read them and understand why they act the way they act. And that's, I'm not sure it's a good answer, but my answer would be that the way that I try to play Abdallah is based on quite a lot of hours of reading what his, I would say, peers of this makeup character, like what other people acted, and try to understand why they did that way, and to be very to be very sensitive towards that. I think in many ways, you know, history is always anachronistic. And then, yeah, I have quite a lot of hours of trying to understand these people. And I think I know what I think I know quite well in that respect. Yeah.
I just wanted to add on the point of anachronicity, yeah, we are doing our best not to be anachronistic, but we cannot avoid it. It's just impossible. And I'm thinking about 3 points or three ways where we are anachronistic, or we can be anachronistic. First way is the Dnd itself. It's the system that makes us do or think or say things that are not realistic in the world that we're playing in. Second thing is our own attitudes that we grew in, so the European culture in general. And the second point is the anachronicity of sources that we are basing on, because at least for my case, in my research in media, the sources that, at least the literary sources that I base on, are far later than the period that we are playing in. So they are not necessarily reflecting the 7th, 8th century that we want to recreate in our game, but they reflect the reality of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. So these are the points that I think we would like to get rid of, but on the other hand, we cannot help but accept some inconsistencies and some imperfections and we have to deal with it, and after all, it's mainly for fun.
Yeah, thank you both, Alon, Shergosh, Aline. This anachronistic point is really interesting as well, because my research, I think Aline and I are the only two who work really like in the 7th to 8th century, kind of this period that we're doing, or like focus mainly on this period. And even then, with the stuff that I'm drawing upon, it's normative literary texts from the 4th, 5th century. And you think a lot of that is foundational to building a character that's living 2-3 centuries later in a different world. So there is a lot of material being shaped. I think, conscious of time, and thank you everyone for asking questions, and this has become more of the Q&A/panel discussion, but I just wanted to pause here briefly to say, especially with a lot of the questions, we'll try to get through them now, but also it'd be great to carry on discussions with people who've asked questions in the text, like through some other means, whether it's emailing or otherwise. But we had been thinking in terms of outcomes and outputs, and people have been reflecting or asking questions about this, about writing a blog about how we're doing this, what we're doing in terms of world building, character building, generating the story, whether to carry on podcasting, but putting it together ourselves, as well as other things in this wake. So it'd be interesting if anyone has any thoughts about what they also would like to see or hear. But as it's after 6:30, I wondered if we should kind of pause directing this ourselves and ask Chloe to come in to pick up on things either that as again, as outside of us, to shepherd us.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Great, thanks for that. I've written down quite a lot of things as you were talking, and some of them have already been picked up by the audience in the chat, in the Q&A as well. So what I might just do is just ask one question, and then and then hand over to the audience Q&A, just because a lot of the things they are asking you are things that I was going to ask as well, which is, so they're on the ball already. I, as you know, I'm a literature scholar, and I work in genre literature in the main. And one thing that's interesting about D&D is that it grows out of wargaming on the one hand, but also out of the fantasy and science fiction genre fan community of the 1970s. And science fiction and fantasy are both genres that are shaped in large parts, particularly through the 20th century, by orientalizing narratives about the majority world by European writers, particularly British and Anglo-American writers. So you've got this layer of orientalizing narratives about the East, just hard baked into D&D, and just in terms of character classes and its and the very fact of having like those kinds of classes and races and stuff, and also in its narrative style, a party of adventurers get together, they go and explore, you know, and that's a very imperial adventure narrative in and of itself. And I liked what Ed was saying about actually what you're doing is flipping that on its head, because you've got world exploration, you've got an already populated world that you're intensely complex social interactions, migrations and networks, that is totally kind of different to that, you know, classic fantasy adventure narrative. So I loved all of that commentary, but it made me think about how you've really got two layers of orientalizing narrative going on, one that's hard baked into D&D and another set that's in certainly the public's conception, or like European public's conception of the history of the Middle East or the history of Egypt, you know, particularly in Britain with that kind of Victorian Egyptology, and that's passed down through like our education system. So all of that, there's all of this kind of layers of orientalizing going on. So how do you deal with that in your approach to gameplay?
That's a great question, I think. I don't know if Ed wants to jump in. Like one tiny thing I'd put in, which reflects on like right at the very beginning, is it's like, I'm playing a monk. You look at D&D, monk is straight away, it's not even Benedictine, Western, like European, let alone North African, Syrian. It's not that type of monk. It's Shaolin monk. It's taking on these roots, and straight away it's like, well, this game doesn't work for me. Like, so how do you navigate these kind of overt ideals that D&D has embedded? Ed, so you're making notes and
yes, thank you, very interesting. So one of the things that it would be nice to do is explore the fantastical as well as the so far it's been relatively mundane. You know, we've been up the Nile and, you know, had troubles with camels and hippos, and had a monastery that with, you know, monks prey to the whisperings of evil, which is very, you know, that happens to monks, right? That's the whole, you know, hagiographies are full of monks being resisting temptation and that sort of thing. So drawing from the literature of this context rather than, well, obviously through our own filter, but not, you know, not going back to a long tradition of Orientalizing, but trying to come, and so not having, we haven't done any of this sort of Arabian Nights stuff. Yeah, though of course Arabian Nights has got local roots as well as the whole French Orientalizing tradition. But we've been, you know, we've been sort of quite, so far, quite working quite mundane, plowing quite a mundane furrow. I would like to develop the fantastic, but the problem with the fantastic is it's often located off the other edge of the map. So it'd be lovely to do, you know, for example, you know, the sorts of people that you see in Marco Polo and those sorts of medieval sort of monstrous people at the edges of the earth. Of course, Marco Polo and people like the Europeans locate some of those in Egypt and in the Middle East, but the Middle Eastern writers wouldn't. They would, you know, they're more like in India, you know, in the Sinbad stories often, you know, you get a boat from Basra and you explore another Orient, right? So that's it's not just it's not just Europeans who Orientalize, it's also Middle Easterners who, you know, the strange white races in the north, or the, you know, the other to their east. And so, yeah, having a legitimate exploration of the fantastic is something that I've been thinking about. So far, we're not there. At the moment, we're working in the known world, as it were. So I think we will get to the point where we fall off the edge of the map. I would like to do that, but now we're in the known world. Just coming back to the question about appropriation as well that somebody else mentioned, and also what kind of research questions we are sort of attacking with this. I would say that the research questions, or the questions that we deal with, are constant. And that's one of the interesting things as a historian. It's like every interaction is a new question that we don't know the answer to. You know, what would he say? How much would he cost? So and these could all be tiny research questions. They're also tiny decisions that we're making that increasingly solidify the world around us. So someone says, how do you decide what's canon? Well, we haven't got to canon yet. We are bit by bit, in every little decision we make, I think we're solidifying the world around us, and using our research, and ideally using not Orientalizing sources, but, you know, Eileen and Jenny are using ostraca that they have been dug up from the, you know, the trash heaps of the Fayum and things like that. So that, you know, there's a whole history of how scholars deal with that stuff as well. But it's not, we're not drinking straight from the source of those old sort of Arabian Nights-y things. Okay, that was a long answer.
No, thank you, Ed. And does anyone else want to kind of come in on that, kind of the Orientalizing elements of D&D, or you're dealing with sort of, I mean, Alon mentioned it a little bit already, kind of thinking about European filters or perspectives on the Muslim past.
Well, it'd be interesting to hear from Shergosh, actually, because when Shergosh says he plays a paladin, and I think you were saying that at one point that you felt this fitted the kind of role of the character that you wanted to play quite well, whereas in some way a paladin could be thought of as the quintessential knight in shiny armor, right? The European warrior of faith. So do you think that is then how does that is that just a medieval, a universal medieval or widespread archetype, or is there some?
Yeah, honestly, I have never come across any information or type of knighthood ever existing in Nubia. Of course, there was an army, there were soldiers, there were generals, there were heroes, most surely, but we simply don't know anything about it. We don't even know about anything about the warfare in Nubia. So what I am doing with my character is to try to be as rational as possible with the few pieces of information that we have. So I imagine him as wearing a long sword because Archangel Michael, represented in a painting in a cathedral at in the city of Faras in northern Nubia, has a long sword, a long straight sword. So I imagine him like that. I imagine him wearing a chainmail because obviously there were no plate mails in Africa. But other than that, it's yeah. This is the point. This is the point where I get anachronistic because I so I put several layers of thinking about Marian Kuda, thinking in terms of the D&D, thinking in terms of European Middle Ages, thinking in terms of my own perception of how it could have looked like. Yeah, so that's perhaps my character is most difficult from among our team to represent in a reliable and faithful manner because of the scarcity of sources.
Yeah, I think, just jump in, I think one of the things where we differ, and it's this where D&D doesn't work for us and D&D campaigns don't work for us, and Tolkien and generally high fantasy doesn't work for us, that there's normally an evil or a bad guy or someone that you're up against, and that bad guy, that enemy is the other. And it's that juxtaposition. We don't have an enemy. Like we fought demons, but that's from the devil, and that's normative to all of, that's going to be relevant to the kind of all the characters. It's not taking, like D&D, the drow or orcs, or representing people of a certain ethnicity as bad because they are the other. And going back to cultural appropriation / appreciation, before, we are all playing people of Northern African / Western Asian background, and none of us clearly are of that background. And for me, it's thinking about what texts we have, how those texts express themselves, the language, and trying to be honest to that. And I've been talking, and we've kind of reached that point now where the party building is doing that and dealing with people who are very different, 2 Egyptians, an Arab and a Nubian. And how do these people interact? Can they interact? And you know, I've been talking with Ed about how I possibly saw this go, and it kind of was woven in. That from my character's perspective, you know, for example, would she balk at the idea of interacting with a Nubian and an Arab? But one's a Christian, one's a Muslim. And at the end of the day thinking, like, her reaction was going to be, well, we're all children of God. And not othering people because they're from a different place. Her reason to go to Jerusalem is that she's heard that they are in need of healers. Like, there's war going on. Like, one of the questions we had before was about bigger history and kind of historical context. We're still at a period where the early Muslim empire is expanding. There's still, I think that we haven't quite set down in what time we are, but they're building at Damascus, they're building in various places. We're in this kind of empire building phase, and lots of people are coming together. In my head, I was clearly living the past 12 months too much, and like, oh, maybe there's some kind of pandemic over in Syria / Jerusalem. I know. And there's a reason for her as a healer to kind of be requested or feel a calling to go, and it's helping other people. And so for me, questions, a lot of the questions going out are about gender and multicultural interaction. These people are all present in Egypt. We're presenting, I think, a very healthy and like very positive image, right? We have a very diverse group that have come together and they're going to journey together, but they are going to look atypical going through Egypt as a group. And so how those responses are going to be from the outside world looking at our party. So navigating and negotiating social cultural expectations and how that goes in. So that's a long answer to go around to. Like, we have lots of things which could be read as orientalizing in terms of jinn and magic and sources and the quote unquote exotic. But a lot of what we're doing is actually really mundane in terms of our day-to-day interactions. I think for me, it's really conscious about not creating an enemy that's the other and kind of falling into tropes that are kind of really obvious, maybe 1970s D&D and beyond fantasy tropes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm just wondering now with the time, is there any particular questions you want to pick up on from the chat that you haven't answered already? I think that question that you touched briefly on there about, I'm just trying to find it now, about the question of the time period. So where are you, the goal, it's from Carlo, and it says, is your goal to highlight a single moment of Mediterranean history? You're trying to convey the major constants of a long period. And I'm asking this because I've developed a historical board game and I've been struggling to depicting micro history and bigger processes at the same time. And Carlo's question picks up something on my notes as well, which is about that tension between big political social forces of history and what you're actually exploring in your game, which is lived experiences and micro histories of individuals. So if you could reflect maybe on Carlo's point and my gloss on Carlo's point, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for picking up, Claire. I remember there being a question along those lines, and then there's been so many thought-provoking questions. Before I jump in, would anybody else like to jump in on that point about micro versus bigger history and constants?
I mean, just to say that the research interests of the team of the group are more micro-historical, and so that inevitably is going to influence the way we play. I think there's going to be a stage if we do level up, and you know, if we follow all the way up. I'm not entirely sure how we're going to do leveling up further on, because they become really these heroic characters, which is fine for medieval thing, but you can't have too many Shanutas, you can't have too many like godlike heroes walking around the landscape. And so do we become those, or do we keep on following this sort of more minor hero route that we go?
Alon, you look like you were going to jump in.
I'm thinking about it more than I have an answer, yes. But I think my first impression to that would be that in a way it's kind of realistic. Now people live their lives. And then I think that throughout the game we'll have probably some connections with the empire, with bigger events, processes, you know, whether it's the governor or the Amir calls us and ask for, I don't know, like a travel document, something that they during this period, they really, or at least the period I think we're playing, they really stressed, focused on, or stuff like that. Or my character, part of my backstory, also is something that, you know, there is an occasion, there is an event because of historical reality that my character responds to. That has yet to be revealed to the rest of the group, but I think that, you know, and I think, you know, that's how people lived in many ways. There was these big processes, and they met people in different times, but it's not like you experienced, I don't know, Islamicization or Arabization on a daily basis necessarily. You definitely feel it sometimes, and I think that probably something that we will experience as well. Or I don't know, or like Shergosh, Marian Kunda's character, you know, it's part of the Bakt, yes. So the way that he even can come to Egypt is based on a historical development of the conquests. So I think there is still micro and macro, of course, they always goes together. Yeah, so that's just thoughts, initial thoughts.
I think this is really interesting when those in the audience are thinking at it from a game building framework, and we're coming at it from a different perspective, right? We're not looking to build a game. For me, in terms of like a big game, right, we're against a backdrop of a world at a time still of transition. Alon mentioned kind of two key phrases that maybe several of us have used in our own articles, right? Arabization and Islamization, the increasing presence of Muslims throughout the lands that they conquer, and the increasing use of Arabic, and these big social, cultural, religious changes that are happening. And we're in the world in Egypt, where Egypt's been conquered for like 60, 70 years. I said, like, we're kind of vague on the dates at this point, but we're within this world where, you know, it's been part of the early Islamic world for 2-3 generations. You're seeing increased mix of people and how this impacts on day-to-day reality. Like just Alon's Abdallah being in Egypt, being himself at this point, married an Egyptian, is testament to kind of the bigger historical framework. And so in terms of like, if we're building a game and you're naming it, like that's like, if this was going to be a game that we were creating, it would be how to get from southern Egypt to Jerusalem, right? There'd be that goal, and whatever mechanics are developed along the way, it's that kind of travel. And what are the things which we come up against? Alon's mentioned it as well, and people like travel permits, who can travel, who can't, paying taxes, being conscripts for the Navy, for building works. We have lots of things going on, and a lot of this, I think all of us would like to explore kind of what's the reality. Like at some point we're going to be told you can't travel beyond this district because you don't have the paperwork. And that kind of very real, big historical implications on people's individual micro worlds. I think we all come from like bottom up history perspective, and rather than top down. And so, yeah, we have that framework, and the game pieces within that hypothetical kind of game building is their own stories and their own ways around this bigger journey within the game. Thank you, Carla, for the question.
I was
sorry, Chloe, go on.
Sorry, I was just saying, I'm looking at the time now. I wonder if you have time for another question, but there is a really interesting one from Robert, who mentions about how do you know what your characters would want or feel, and the kind of motivations when you're going off of written historical sources, as you've said, you know, some of which are from a later date and also are perhaps coy about like they're not giving you the full story as it is were anyway. So perhaps maybe a couple of points on that about character motivation, and then I think we'll have to finish.
Who would like to jump in first with how, because I think we've all been thinking about this in certain ways. I think we're also very coy about not giving up too much to our fellow players, because there's still stuff that we've kept held back as well. But would someone like to jump in? Alon.
Well, the honest answer is that I don't know what would my character do or want. In a way, I play this game because it's given me the liberty or the freedom to choose what my research subject would choose to do. Whatever I do is again based on what I've read of my subject, my research subject doing, and how they lived. And then I try to imagine, you know, what would be the response to specific things. Yeah, like there was one time, yeah, I don't know if it's in the recording or not, but you know, oh yes, Ed asked us, so what do you want to do now? You have time. And said, oh yeah, I need to pray. So that was something I know that they wanted, but I think it's nice to have this game because it actually gives you the freedom to choose what you do and to change the way that you act actually from situations to situation. You don't have to act according to what an Arab Muslim ex-military guy would have done every time, because that's again something that we tend to do as researchers. But as a player, I can actually play with that and say, no, I don't want to get into this fight now, even though, yeah, I don't like this Nubian coming to my land or something like that. No, actually, I can do other stuff. Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think for me, it's still something that I think of more than I have an answer to.
Yeah, exactly. Our characters are fictional characters, yes. They are inspired by what we know and what we want to find out or explore more about that historical context. But as Alon said, their decisions or their motivations are mostly based on what we imbued in them. But for my character, for example, she is a person who she's a kind of social survivor. She has her own motivations for other things that she's very curious about, but her main motivation or her main the main motivation for what she does is trying to keep her status, trying to use her influence so that things go her way, whatever she wants. And I know that's a very vague answer, but that's one of the important parts of her character is being a little bit manipulative in order to maintain her status in society or you know get people to do what she wants.
And if I can just add there is, I think the mechanics of the game are quite important there, because we have all these, if we had to approach these as scholars, we would be constantly paralyzed. Whereas with the game, we have a playground where we can make these decisions and then forget about them. And the roll of the dice will have the final decision. If we don't know what to do, roll a dice, that makes the decision and we can move on.
Maybe that's a good place to, that's a really good place to start, because we've just got to 7:30, haven't we, Jenny? And Ed's point there about the game is maybe a nice way to end the discussion. So shall we, I'll hand back over to you, Jenny, for like thanks and rounding up.
Yeah, I'm going to take my prerogative as quote unquote chair just to reflect on that. And one of the things we're talking about is how playing these characters may be constraining or liberating. On the one hand, I'm quite constrained because I'm playing a character that's very different, also just in terms of how she'd react to things. But on the other hand, because we're not a standard D&D group, for example, in the podcast, Elaine sends her cousin, servant Apollonia, to come and ask me to help. And I say no, because that's not my motivation. My motivation isn't to search for lost goods, it's to stay by the bedside of the sick Mother Superior in this monastery. And so some of that kind of characterization actually, for my character, I think is quite fixed. But it does allow this kind of freedom to explore opportunities rather than just constraints. But I think at this point I have certainly spoke enough today. Thank you so much, everybody, for questions. There have been so many fantastic questions in the chat. Apologies for maybe not addressing all of them. Our Twitter handles are in the chat. We'll also add that to the podcast, and if you would like emails or anything else, you can find us through social media most readily, at that point. At this point, I'd like to do some final thank yous. Once again, thank you to Chloe and Paul for the assistance this evening. Thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to Chris Gregory of Alternate Stories and Fake Realities for the podcast. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Manchester Met Centre for Creative Writing, English Literature and Language. I probably messed that up massively, but thank you for the support. Thank you to Asmodee Research and Gaming Lab. Thank you to MGSN. Thank you to my players and GM and so our panelists this evening. I can't emphasize enough kind of how invigorating for me like this whole process has been, and